Good evening and welcome. My name is Jim Vettinger. I'm the director of the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships at Stanford. And the Knight Fellowships and the Pulitzer Prizes are sponsoring tonight's conversation with the Pulitzer Prize winners from the Los Angeles Times. We're doing this event for a very particular reason, which is to celebrate and honor, and we hope encourage, investigative watchdog, public accountability journalism. And on that account, on two accounts, I want to thank the three journalists who are here, Paloma Esquivel, Ruben Vives, and Jeff Gottlieb. I want to thank them first for coming up here from Los Angeles, but more than that, I want to thank them for the work that they have done. You'll hear a lot more about it tonight, how it was done, the challenges to it, but it is absolutely at the core of the central mission of journalism, which is to hold public institutions accountable by informing citizens. As I mentioned, they did win the Pulitzer Prize. I want to honor and recognize one other person here tonight, who is David Kennedy, who is a Stanford history professor, the director of the Lane Center for the American West, but most importantly for tonight's event, was the chair of the Pulitzer Board when the prize was awarded. So thank you very much, David, for being here. Tonight's format will be very informal. I want to introduce tonight's moderator, T. Christian Miller, who is a current Knight Fellow and a crack investigative reporter in his own right, starting with the St. Petersburg Times, later at the Los Angeles Times, and now at ProPublica, and is working this year on his Knight Fellowship on an investigative model for overseas investigative reporting of public corporations. Again, we thank you for coming. We think this mission is extremely important, and with that, I'll turn it over to you, T.
Thanks very much, Jim, and thanks, David, for being here. As Jim said, I'm a Knight Fellow this year. My name is T. Miller. I go by T. I work for ProPublica now, but I am a Los Angeles Times alumni. And I'm extremely proud of that fact. And there was no prouder moment, perhaps, for me last year than when I heard that the LA Times had won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service Journalism for its coverage of corruption in the city of Bell. The Pulitzer Prize for Public Service Journalism is journalism's highest honor. The LA Times has won it 6 times, which is more than any other newspaper, including that other Times on the East Coast. And anybody who's ever watched or paid attention to the LA Times, that would not come as a surprise. The LA Times has always been a paper that prided itself, not always, in the last 20 or 30 years, has been a paper that prided itself on long-form, in-depth investigative journalism, on really hard-hitting investigative journalism, on really in-depth journalism. And it's always been an incubator for that kind of work, and the 3 panelists we have today will talk about some of that work that they've done. But what they will also probably talk about is that it wasn't just them. In their coverage of the city of Bell and the corruption that happened there, and that was, they'll tell you, this was not small-scale corruption. This was like Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed. This was sort of a massive, large-scale, citywide corruption, hands in every pocket. The LA Times threw all of its resources to covering that story. And at one point in time, I believe there was 20 or so journalists devoted to covering the city of Bell. Now, for those of you who don't know it, Bell's a tiny little town, a suburb of Los Angeles, south of Los Angeles. It's small, impoverished, largely Latino. It has a population of about 35,000 people. So if you had 20 people, I did the math today. If you had 20 people covering a town of 35,000, it was probably the best covered community in the United States at that particular moment in time. And the results showed. They won, the accolades have been mentioned, every major investigative award, the Pulitzer Prize, the George Polk, IRE, the Selman Ring, they all won those accolades. Tremendous impact. You have more than a half dozen city officials that are currently under investigation, state auditors coming in, all sorts of activity that happened because of their work. But if I was going to talk about the most important thing that I think, for me, what their work did, was it gave the people of the city of Bell a voice. This was a forgotten community. This was a forgotten corner. This was forgotten corruption. And the LA Times threw its resources behind this town to re-engage it, reinvigorate it, re-energize it, make it part of a functioning, active civil society, a civil democracy, again, functioning. It really gave the community a voice. And so what we're going to do tonight, my little plan, I'm the moderator, I get to make this up. I'm going to ask questions of each of the three, one question of each of the three panelists to kind of help set the stage for this. But then we're going to turn it over to the audience. I'm going to do sort of Phil Donahue style. I have my little microphone here, for those of you who remember Phil Donahue. And we'll ask questions. And I really want to sort of engage in a conversation about both the investigation that happened at the city, in the city, and what they did, and how they did it, because that's very interesting. But I also want to talk about the larger issue that Jim mentioned, which is sort of the future of journalism, and especially investigative journalism, which is probably the most threatened kind of journalism, the journalism that's under most threat in the country today. It's the most expensive. And then an era of shrinking newsrooms and shrinking staff, the question that we should all be considering is, who is going to have that microphone for people in the city of places like Bell 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now? Because that's really what's at stake. It's about giving voice to the voiceless, that old phrase, and it's true. So if journalism disappears, and if investigative watchdog journalism disappears, who's going to be left to tell the story of people who are being preyed upon, or who are being the victims of corruption, abuse, human rights abuses, wherever they are in the world? So I want to talk about that, Laura. I hope that we have some questions that come up about investigative journalism and where it's going and how we fund that. And it's important, really, to democracy, as Jim said. So let me first talk about our panelists, each of whom took very interesting and different paths to the LA Times. Ruben Vives is here as closest to me. I've heard that he's too shy to tell this story, so I'm going to tell it for him. His mother was an immigrant from Guatemala who came to Los Angeles. She wasn't able to bring him up immediately, wasn't able to afford the fees to pay the smugglers to bring up immediately. So it took you were 6 when you arrived in the U.S. about? And he grew up in the U.S. from that age on. But in his teens, his mother began to worry a little bit about his immigration status. What was it? Was he a quote-unquote illegal, and what was his immigration status? Luckily for her, she happened to be working for two former Los Angeles Times reporter, former business editor Bob Magnuson and Sean Hubler, who kind of helped clarify his immigration status, but also helped point him toward journalism for all of our benefits. He went to work for the LA Times kind of as a copy clerk, was thrown into another Pulitzer Prize winning story for public service several years ago. That involved a hospital in south central Los Angeles that had the name of Killer King because of how many people died there. For any journalism, graduate school business kids who are into rebranding, I don't know how you rebrand a hospital called Killer King. But he worked there. He was hired and now began covering this big swath of communities which exists sort of south of the city of central Los Angeles, in between Los Angeles and Long Beach. He was partnered there with our next panelist, who's Jeff Gottlieb. On the day the Pulitzers were announced, the editor of the LA Times, a guy named Russ Stanton, was quoted in the LA Times story as being a grizzled veteran, which I'm not sure if I want to be called a grizzled veteran, but it was in recognition of Jeff's extraordinary track record as one of the country's finest and most decorated investigative reporters. He began his career in Southern California, came up to San Jose Mercury News, where he won his first big award, a George Polk Award, covering some questionable use of funds at a certain private university in the peninsula whose name begins with an S and has a cardinal as their color. The Stanford president at the time resigned during that particular series of stories. He then joined the Los Angeles Times, where he was both an editor and a reporter. And then finally we have Paloma Esquivel, who joined the Times in 2007. She's an immigration reporter. Before joining the Times, she worked for Color Lines, TheNation.com, but she also had I'm going to embarrass her a little bit here. It's an interesting series of jobs before then, which include working at a home for boys, a Spanish language TV station, and Victoria's Secrets at the mall before she joined the LA Times, where she was also part of the team of coverage that worked down in Bell, uncovering the corruption in Bell. So I'm going to get this started by basically, as I said, setting the stage and then hoping that we can have this conversation about the particular investigation and about investigative journalism. So I'd like to start with Jeff. And Jeff, if you could just set the stage for us. Tell us how you first got on to this story and what happened after the first stories began publishing.
Well, what happened is, actually it starts with Reuben, who was covering the city of Maywood, which is next to Bell. And Maywood, because it was so screwed up in the way its government was being run, could not get insurance. So the city council decided to lay off almost all of its city workers. And the police work was going to be done by the LA County Sheriff's Department. And they decided that its neighbor of Bell would do the city services. So Reuben finds out about this. I get brought in. Reuben and I write that story. And which, as you can imagine, a lot of people liked. This city was getting rid of all of its employees. And so Reuben and I had both heard that there were investigations going on in Maywood. So I then called the DA, what's called the Public Integrity Division, the LA County DA, and I asked the head of it, so are you guys investigating Maywood? And he says, no, because other people are. So we're not going to waste our time. And I don't know why I asked him this. I said, what about Bell? And he says, as a matter of fact, we're investigating the high salaries its city council members are getting paid. And I say to him, what do you mean? I have no idea what you're talking about. He says, well, we think they're getting paid $100,000 a year. Now, this is a part-time job. This is if, a city council member in Palo Alto. And by state law, they should be getting, $6,000 a year, something like that. So Reuben and I write that story. And that reminded me of a story I had done at the Mercury News, which was about the East Palo Alto Sanitary District. Now, I don't have to explain to you guys what East Palo Alto is like. But the sanitary district there had built a Taj Mahal office building, which was the nicest building in town, and its staff and its elected board members were traveling around the country spending money on fancy hotels, fancy meals, lots of money spending things they shouldn't have been doing it on. And I wrote that story, and I think one or two people ended up being charged on that. Same dynamics, minority city. I figure if these guys are making $100,000 a year, city council members, they have to be ripping the city off for other things. So the next day, Reuben and I go to City Hall in Bell. We asked to see this guy, Bob Rizzo, who's the city manager. Actually, his title is Chief Administrative Officer, and he won't come out and see us, which is odd, considering it's not very often two LA Times reporters show up in Bell. The city clerk comes out. We explained to her that what we want to see are contracts, minutes of meetings. What else we want to see? Contracts, minutes of meetings, expenses, right. A couple other things. She hands us a form. I fill it out. I figure it's some bureaucratic thing. She then says, okay, you'll get it in 10 days, which she's entitled to do under the State Public Records Act. However, she should have turned around. It should have taken her 10 minutes to give us this stuff. Here, she should have turned around and given us the folders of the minutes and said, knock yourselves out. So I said to her, if we don't get it in 10 days, we're going to sue. And then I asked for a copy of this form I'd filled out. And she gives a copy to me, charges me $1. So in this 10-day period, I'm talking to people in Bell. And what I'm hearing is something's wrong in Bell. No one can put their arms around it, but something's wrong. People are saying this guy Rizzo makes a lot of money. How much? Oh, $300,000, $400,000. Which is more than he should be making, but not such a huge amount. At the same time, every day I'm calling up the city clerk. our documents ready? She's saying, no, I told you 10 days. And I'm saying, we don't get them, we're going to sue, and then we're going to turn around when we win and ask the judge to have you pay our legal bills, because that's what's in the law. Day 9, she calls me and says, we're going to give you the documents tomorrow, and Mr. Rizzo would like to meet with you. Great. And I say, where? And she says, Little Bear Park. And I'm thinking, that's kind of odd. And Little Bear Park is sort of a place where I would take my 3-year-old. So I literally had visions that we were going to meet this guy on the park bench. And so Reuben and I went separately. And Reuben and I didn't talk about this for several months after. But Reuben is sitting in the parking lot copying down the license plates of the cars in the parking lot. Because he knows, he's been watching too many TV shows, he knows that the white van is going to drive up, pull him out and kidnap him. And that when they find his car, the license plates of these cars with him, they'll be able to find him. See, this is what I had to work with for a year. Okay. So it turns out we didn't meet on the park bench. There was a meeting room in there. It was where the Boy Scouts used to meet. And so we walk into the room, and Rizzo has brought with him 10 people, clearly trying to intimidate us. A couple lawyers, city council members, other city staff. Reuben and I are sitting actually sort of like this, although not on a podium. And the documents are over here. Rizzo and crew are sitting around this table. So we start asking questions. And Rizzo's contract is here, and they expect us somehow to look at these documents, but we're going to get them, so why bother to waste our time looking at them there? And finally I look at Rizzo and I say, so how much money do you make? And Rizzo says, $700,000, which was such a high figure, I wasn't sure I was hearing him correctly. So I say again, how much? And Reuben says,
I said Jesus Christ.
And then I said to Rizzo, so you're probably the highest paid city manager in LA County. And he says, I'm sure I am. If that's the number of people choke on, maybe I'm in the wrong business. I could go into private business and make that money. The council has compensated me for the job I've done. And everyone is defending him. Everyone there, what a great guy he is. And they have good parks. And the city was near bankruptcy when he came in 1993. Then I turned to the police chief, who's there in a coat and tie. He had been the police chief in Glendale, had retired the next week, taken the job in Bell. I asked him, I said, how much do you make? And he says, $457. And I say, and what did you make in Glendale? And he says, $235. Then I turn to Angela Spaccia, the assistant city manager, and I say, how much do you make? She says, I don't know. And then Reuben proceeds as just, what do you mean you don't know? Everyone knows what they make. And she's, I don't know. And you can just start hearing her tap dancing. Rizzo finally says, she makes about $350. And actually, she made $376. So this meeting went on for 4 hours. And we were, the 2 city council members there, and we were making $100,000, and I asked them, do you make more than $100,000 in your real lives? And Oscar Hernandez, who was the mayor, who owned a little bodega next to the park, Oscar says, oh yeah, I do. And he's smiling. We don't think he's telling the truth. And Luis Artiga, who's a minister, he says, oh no, there's no way, I don't make that much money. And he said he didn't know how much money he was going to make on the council when he was appointed in 2008. And so I said, well, what did you think when you got your first check? And he says, I thought it was a gift from God. So, okay, that meeting was on a Friday. This meeting was on a Friday. Add up Rizzo's contract. I added up, and I find out, and they were written in a way to make it difficult to figure out his salary. And I would say talk about pay periods and not tell you how much a pay period is. Gets a 12% raise this time and a 5% raise in June. And so I come out that he makes $787,637 a year. It's more than 700. So I tell Reuben that, and I say, you tell me what you come up with. And Reuben comes up with the same figure I did. So I call Rizzo. I said, Bob, we come up with 787. You said 700. Where are we wrong? And this is the last conversation I ever had with Rizzo. And he says, well, I think you're high, but that's okay. It actually turned out, and I told Reuben, tell you what, we'll go with our figure. I'm willing to write the correction that says Bob Rizzo didn't make 787, he only made 750. It turned out we were wrong. Because we wrote a story a month or two later that Rizzo actually made $1.5 million. Because in his contract got, I believe it was 26 weeks vacation and sick leave, which he every year, it wasn't accumulated. This was every year that he would then cash in. Okay, so this meeting's on a Friday. The story then appears in the website Wednesday evening, in the newspaper Thursday morning, and all hell breaks loose. Our BlackBerries are just filled. I mean, Reuben keeps his on vibrate, and he said I kept waking him up. It was just extraordinary, the number of emails we got, some saying great story, others giving us tips, others saying, come investigate our city, like Denver, Long Island, New Jersey. Then, that's a Thursday. Then it happened there was a council meeting, a Bell City council meeting on Monday. It's at 6 o'clock. So Reuben goes to cover the meeting. And I'm in the office and I'm getting my stuff together to go home. Reuben calls the city desk and he says, there are like hundreds of people out here. Jeff should come to this meeting. Because, it's hard for him to cover this, be inside and cover the outside. And the Bell, it's 92 people in this room. It seats 92 people, the Bell City Council chambers. So I drive up, and by this time we had done a video on our website. And I'm carrying a reporter's notebook, a thin thing. So I think people sort of knew who we were. So I walk into this crowd. There must have been, 500 people there? Something like that?
At least, yeah.
At least. The crowd sees me, and the crowd literally parts. The crowd just parts as I walk through it. And people are patting me on the back and, congratulating me and asking for my autograph. It was just extraordinary. And so what happens in the council meeting eventually is, as in most small councils, most cities, there's a public comment part. And so people would come up and say, okay, I think the city council members, you guys should be put in prison. And the next person would come and say, no, he's wrong. He should be executed. And this would go on as council meetings went on later on. These meetings would go on until 2 in the morning, and this guy had to stay at these things until eventually the councils stopped showing up. So there couldn't be a quorum. So the city couldn't get any work done. So that was just sort of how the whole thing started. And that was, we ended up writing, 100 stories or, 200 stories. And this thing went on and on and on. And it was just extraordinary.
Okay, great. So now, Reuben, that's sort of the beginning of the corruption, and we're going to get to more of it. But Reuben, when we were talking beforehand, one thing that struck me about when we had a conversation was you said that you were kind of asked, well, did you have the right documents, or did you wonder about having the right documents, and what documents did you have? And so I want you to talk a little bit about, number one, how did you know that you have the right documents? And would the story have been different from a journalistic perspective if you had only had people telling you, this guy makes a lot of money, we're not exactly sure what it was. If you hadn't had that paper, those numbers you were able to add up, how would that have changed the story? And then were you certain that you really did have the right story with the documents that you had?
I think the impact certainly would have been different. Having the documents, and now in this multimedia world that we're living in, we were able to upload some of these documents so that regular readers, as you would be able to go through the same document that we went through, and we'd highlight what we saw and what we sort of held questionable and why we led up to the figures that we had reported. With the council members making nearly close to $100,000 a year. How did they get those salaries? Well, here's how they got it. It was through these city boards that they met. In fact, we learned they only met once. There was one board that only met like once every 4 years. It was just such a bizarre thing. But you'd have a breakdown of how the salaries were being earned by these officials. Later on, we didn't know this, but we had gotten, going back to when Jeff had requested these documents from the city clerk in Bell, we had a hard time trying to get documents from the city, so we even wrote a story about how difficult it was for us to get these documents. But when we did, there was a new law firm that came in for the city that was hired, and they started sort of flushing out these requests that we had made, and they had pointed out to us that there were these fake contracts, and we didn't get these contracts. Now, these were legitimate, like if you look at them, same reading as the first contracts that Jeff and I looked at. The 12% increase, 4% increase on his car allowance, so you got to add it all up. These were the exact same contracts. The only difference was that we learned that the person who signed it, the council member who signed it as mayor, wasn't in fact the mayor at the time. So we learned that these contracts, there were 5 contracts, and essentially what they were created, it was to break up Bob Rizzo's pay, so that you'd have to get all 5 contracts to come up with the 787 that we were able to get at the very beginning. And so if a citizen were to come in, I want to see Bob Rizzo's contract, I want to see the city manager's contract, he'd have specifically one contract for a city manager. So he'd pull that out and give it to you, and you'd see, oh, he's not making that much money that everyone claims he is. So we got these contracts, and we started looking through them, and I looked at the date. It was September 2008, and it had the city attorney's signature. Oscar Hernandez had signed it under the mayor line, and Bob Rizzo had signed it. And so, I started, by this time we had already learned that almost everything in Bell was just kind of like, was it ever approved? That was the question we were always asking. Was this approved by the council or not? And so this was kind of one of those questions. So I went through the council meetings and learned, in fact, that the mayor, Oscar Hernandez, in fact, was not the mayor in 2008. In fact, it was another council member, George Mirabal. And so we were able to write a story about how these contracts were fake and they were used. Eventually, Bob Rizzo got charged for this, for trying to hide his salary. But how could we have known? That was just lucky guess. It was just the idea of us constantly realizing, like, was this approved by the council, or was it approved by Bob Rizzo himself? Because by then we had learned that there had been loans that he had given out to city employees. There were things that he had power over, and that he was just basically doing it without the council's approval. And so by then we already had this sort of idea of, like, was this approved by the council or not? And so would a reporter be able to, I think Jeff and I had this discussion before, and I think we probably would have been duped if we had those contracts from the very beginning. If he had given us those contracts, we looked and like, oh, he's not making, just that one city manager contract, we would have looked and said, well, I don't think he's making that much money. We would have walked away. But at some point, someone probably would have figured out, when his pension, when he retires, you'd see like, oh my God, he's making this much. And so it's hard to tell if you're getting a document like that.
So it's interesting. Let me ask you, so do you consider this to have been more of a document-based story or more of a source-based story? Or
this was a little of both. There was really document-based. We'd use council meetings. We had a room devoted to all the public records that we requested from Bell. Eventually, this conference room became known as the Bell Room. And I kid you not, it was just this table full of manila folders, boxes, and CDs of all the documents that we requested. LA Times document request August 15. There were agendas, minutes, list of vendors, contracts. We had property records. I mean, we were scrubbing the entire city from council members, looking at their personal, their forms that they had filed, the 700 forms, that they filed for, like, I own this business, in case there's a conflict of interest. And so we used a lot of that to basically tell the stories. And I mean, good examples of that were, I think Paloma's stories were just a prime example of those. The salary stories that Jeff and I did about, how council members were earning their salaries. So it was, on that scale, it was, again, it was document-based. And then, of course, we were developing sources, and we were getting information from sources, and that's how we were able to sort of guide our investigative coverage by, what people were telling us and what we were seeing on documents. We put those together. Someone would tell us something, we'd confirm it through a document or through another independent source, put that together, and then we tell the story, and we try to show it. I mean, it was really, at the start of it was, we have to show you, we have to prove it with documents.
So that's a good segue to Paloma, because one of the stories, it wasn't just about this one guy and his cronies and getting rich. It was actually Bell as a whole city was affected, and then people were affected, and business people were affected. So Paloma, you mentioned that there was kind of a ripple that you saw in covering a city and what you saw. Tell us about some of those ripples. How were ordinary, everyday people in Bell affected by all this?
Yeah, it's interesting for me because Ruben and Jeff had been covering the story for a while, and I had just been sort of reading their stories as a fan. And then the Times, really decided that it was going to make this effort, pull together a bunch of reporters to look at a lot of those, documents and a lot of there were a lot of rumors going around, that about property taxes and things like that that we really wanted to look into. But my feeling naively when I was asked to do this was that, what's left? Like they've broken this amazing story, and what else could there possibly be? And then I realized very quickly that almost every rumor that we heard, almost every bad the thing that people were complaining about turned out to be there turned out to be something to it. So some of the things that I was able to help report on was the property tax issue. This city that is one of the poorest in the county had the second highest property taxes in the county, and something that turned out to be an illegally raised tax, at least part of it. Through talking to people, we learned about about impound practices, where basically the police department was told and officers were told to go out and impound cars, and it was essentially to raise revenue in this city where a lot of the population is undocumented, so people don't have licenses. So if you pull over the right car, chances are they're not going to have a license, and you can impound the car, and the city stood to gain hundreds, if not thousands of dollars off each impound. Beyond that, they were doing not just police and traffic enforcement to impound cars, but they were doing using their code enforcement officers to do this. So people for things like selling mangoes on the street, or for providing plumbing services, would get their cars impounded and have to pay hundreds of, if not thousands of dollars. And this brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars to the city. So I think the thing that we realized was that anything that they could possibly do to tap revenue, to increase revenue, even if it was just, a few $100s here, $25 here, $1,000 there. They did. We also did a story about about how businesses were being affected by this, by what essentially was just sort of this arbitrary fee. Again, in this community, which is largely Latino, a lot of immigrant business owners who sometimes didn't know, exactly what was appropriate and what was not appropriate, were being asked to pay thousands of dollars every year in these sort of arbitrary taxes just for, I guess, the privilege of doing business in the city. So.
And we call arbitrary fees bribes in other countries, right? I believe wasn't there one guy actually wrote bribe on his check or something like that?
Yeah.
That he'd had to pay.
I mean, that was definitely the feeling, and yeah.
I like that. Arbitrary fee makes it sound so much nicer. All right, so now I'd like to that's sort of, you got the broad strokes of it. Are there questions people have? Let's start over here.
Two things very quickly. One, when the fish feels the hook, it often puts up quite a fight. And it does not sound like these guys called your publisher, threatened libel suits and all the rest. What kind of pushback did you get? And the second thing is, when did your own thinking shift from impropriety and excess to illegality? When did illegal start showing up in print, and what was the tipping point?
Right, well, I mean, early on, we got the only push, well, at the very beginning, we really didn't get pushback because they knew legally we were entitled to these documents. Now, at the end of the powwow that Ruben and I had with these guys, it ended, Ruben and I were was talking to an attorney from Bell. The three of us were the only ones left, and he said, I told them they had to give you the documents. I told them that they would take a hit, but then things would blow over. So I think that's what they thought. Okay, we did ultimately get pushback when we tried to get more documents, and our attorney was threatening to sue, and then the city brought in a new city attorney and things cleared up. But then your question about when did it go from impropriety to illegal, the $700,000 story, there's a line in it quoting the head of the Public Integrity Division saying it's not illegal to make too much money. I think, though, that Ruben and I walked out of that original meeting. We knew, we walked out of there with 10, 15 story ideas. We knew there was some illegal stuff going on. I think pretty early we knew. You can't. You can't. It would if you look at our coverage, I assume it refers to alleged. You have to be careful. You can't accuse someone of breaking the law.
I think the charges were ultimately kind of concealment of income charges, weren't they?
Corruption. Yeah, there were corruption charges in September. But you have to be careful how you couch it. You say that you write what they did, then you quote. Get an expert who says, if they do this is breaking the law. Ruben made a reference to the loans. Rizzo gave out, I think, $1.5 million of city money to employees as loans. And we wrote that story, and then we had quotes from people saying this is unheard of. You don't do that kind of thing. That kind of.
You ever get threatened or pushed back? like in sotto voce kind of ways?
No, other than, I tell Jeff, I think we, I keep telling people that I feel that we shot our foot when we did the first story about the $800,000 salary and the rest of the other officials there in the city, because that eventually brought in the DA, the Attorney General. It brought just every agency into Bell. And what they were telling us, we can't get to your public records request because the state is more important than you are. And I'm like, no, according to the law, everyone's equal. You got 10 days, so you better, come up with those, those documents. And then I would even ask, under the Public Records Act, you can request to see the documents during business hours. So I asked for that, and they're like, I can't get to that because I got to deal with this public records request. I'm like, you can't. No, you can't do that. I said, you have to, meet my requests. And so I would camp out at City Hall basically on a day-to-day basis. I was just there, and got to a point where they were joking around that I should be added to the payroll because I was that's one of the employees there. And so that was the only pushback that we got. It was just that difficultness of getting those public records. But we were able to get help through sources also to get a hold of some of those documents.
There's a certain level of irony, I guess, in the fact that if the LA Times had been covering Bell government all along, this whole story wouldn't have broken because reporters would have seen what was going on and stopped it. Has there been discussion about sort of the lack of coverage in communities like Bell and how it leads to situations exactly like this?
I mean, we already knew that we hadn't been covering that area for a very long time. We used to have a bureau office based in Huntington Park, and we used to have about 4 reporters there stationed covering that area. And then, bad times hit us, and we were losing revenue, and we were closing down bureau offices from Ventura to basically Huntington Park. We shut down that bureau office.
Orange County.
Or did we also? We took a big hit there, but we didn't lose it completely.
No.
We lost the Ventura office. We lost the Huntington Park office. Eventually, we lost the Long Beach office. Anyways, going back to that Huntington Park, those 4 reporters that were there were gone, and no one was keeping an eye on that area anymore. In fact, I think one of my colleagues, sort of Hector Becerra, wasn't really assigned to that area, but he felt that it was important cover, that he would sometimes occasionally cover stories out of there because he sort of knew the history of the Southeast. And I had, during my years of as a copy messenger, I would see that we would actually cover that area. We had covered, I say there's about 12 cities in that region, that Southeast region. And of the 12 cities, I'd say about 6 of them have been under investigation by either the FBI or the District Attorney's Office. We covered a lot of those stories, but we never really went in there. And so I think this has, now we've devoted our resources there. We're looking at Montebello, we're looking at Vernon, Vernon, which is a city that has 96 residents, and you have an official there making millions of dollars a year, from contract money that, him being hired as city administrator. We've covered we're looking at other cities now in that area, and we're definitely keeping an eye on it, and we definitely don't want to, let what happened in Bell happen again. And so there certainly has been, I think, would you say, more of a increase in keeping that area, watching that area?
Yeah.
But it's hard, it's hard. You have...
Our staff is half the size it was. We can't cover what we used to cover.
And this speaks to about, the stability about investigative reporting, how difficult it has become. It's costly, it takes time, it gets harder because, it was just me covering that area, 12 cities, just by myself. Who has time to crank out stories and then do investigative stories? It's almost quite hard to do it all at the same time. We have one person, at least 2 people now, only in Orange County, which is one of the other big counties that we have down there. San Fernando Valley, Right. So it can be very difficult when you don't have the staff to keep an eye on just about every town. It certainly is a task.
But one of the, what also happened in this, once we started breaking stories, and it was just, crank them out, it became novelistic, it was they were the bad guys, we were the good guys. These stories just kept, boom, landing, and we'd write these stories. No one else looked at Bell. no one did any investigative reporting on Bell other than us. And there should have been other people. You know, TV's reporting was, we'd put a story on our website, and that night there'd be a TV truck out there going, you know, the LA Times is reporting today. I mean, no one else did any of this stuff. And I don't think that says particularly good things about journalism.
I think it got to a point where I even told the city manager and the city attorney, just let me know when the New York Times is around. Because I thought, you know, then I'd be a little more concerned about really competition coming in. But that never really did happen. Although I want to end it on a positive note. This story sort of, it sort of reminded every newspaper of, you know, the things that we're good at. This is simple reporting. It didn't take anything special. It didn't take, you know, it just took simple requests of a document, of a contract, looking at someone's salary, and then boom, you know, this huge thing. And then there were small newspapers sending the reporters, city hall reporters, you know, go find out how much councils are making. And it eventually led to this thing about the state controller requiring cities to now publicly put the salaries of all their employees, so that on their, you know, on the city website, so that people have access to this information. And so it certainly brought change, and I think it certainly gave some newspapers their mojo of you know, hey, this is what journalism is about. You know, let's keep doing this. And so, but again, it's a challenge when you don't have the numbers of reporters that you once used to in the old days.
So, without having done the extensive investigative reporting that you did, could you, or with someone with greater financial acumen, have looked at the budgets or whatever the publicly reported annual documents for the city were and figured out that there was something highly irregular going on here?
It's a good question. I mean, you speaking specifically about the budget, or are you referring to like the contracts and that kind of stuff? Because anyone could have figured out if you could do fifth grade math, you could have figured out the contracts.
Well, somewhere in the annual cash flow or the budget, I would think, but I don't know, that all of these irregular activities would have either shown up or had to be buried somewhere.
I mean, we were looking at the budget, and what Bell did is they approved this 5-year budget. So, you know, you'd see like, oh, here's what we're earning in 2008 and 2009, this, and then you see from there on, they're all flat numbers. They're all similar numbers. They're basically projecting that they're going to be earning. So it was almost to a point useless to us. We looked at the budget. It was such a confusing thing. They were transferring money all around. It was just, you know, it took, I think, a while for us to really go through it and start to figure out how is it that Bell is able to sustain maintain these salaries, these high salaries. And we even thought that the independent auditing firms that the city hires to bring in to look at the finances and, you know, give the stamp and say, okay, you're in financial stability, you're good. Even those reports were practically useless also. We eventually learned that only through the state controller, when he came in and did an audit of the city's
We did a story
finances.
first.
Did we?
We did. Yeah, I mean, what you mentioned, I mean, cities in California are required to have an independent auditor come in every year and look at their books. The independent auditor in this case, which is a big firm, Mayor Hoffman McCann, they gave them clean audits every year. And I'm talking, I think it was from 1994 on. So they found nothing wrong. Well, clearly something's wrong, because if a couple boneheads like us can come in and find something wrong, you know. But when we looked at some of the stuff in the books beyond some documents, for example, you'd see something that would have a number and it would say administrative agreement. Well, what the hell's an administrative agreement? Well, what it turned out is those were the loans that Rizzo. I mean, I think someone, but the actual budget itself could have been difficult.
So let me ask that question in another little more controversial way. There's a lot of movement in journalism now towards citizen journalism and toward crowdsourcing of journalism and shifting journalistic functions to ordinary people. And so, as you mentioned, Ruben, now they're putting transparent documents up on the web. Do you think that citizen journalists or crowdsourcing techniques could have done this story?
I have to say, I am not an expert in municipal government. You know, I learned so much just working on these stories. I, had looked at a few budgets before, but had never really delved deeply into any of these things before. And I think that, that's what journalists do. You're not an expert in these things. You figure them out and you call experts. And I think a lot of people can do that, whether or not, citizen journalists maybe don't have the resources that we do to have the lawyers who backed us, who helped, a lot with these stories. But some of that, I definitely think that can be done. I don't know.
See, here's what I think about citizen journalists. First of all, I would encourage anyone to do it. The more the merrier. And oftentimes what would be citizen journalists, there are people calling us up, giving us tips. But, we're professionals. This is what we're trained to do, we've gone to school, we've studied it. We know what we're doing. It's our job. So I think it sort of denigrates us when you talk about citizen journalists coming in and doing, what we do. And we also, Paloma mentioned resources. We know that, for example, in Bell, that other people got fake documents. One guy came in and asked what Rizzo's salary was and got a document that said Rizzo made $185,000 a year. We know that other people got pushback when they asked for documents. But when we came in and said, we're going to sue. I wasn't messing around. We were going to sue. Whereas in Bell, if Juan Gonzalez comes in and says, and they don't give him a document, well, he probably doesn't understand the law. B, he doesn't have the money to get an attorney. So that's sort of my view on this.
Just to follow up on that question a little bit, there was actually a really interesting case in the city of Lindsay in Central California after this Bell story broke and after the California Controller's Office started putting all this stuff online. There's a committee of like 5 people sitting in someone's living room, and they did subpoena all of these documents, and they started adding up how much the council made, and they tried to recall all of these people, and they found all of the same information, but the ability to analyze it properly and put it in context I don't think was there, and I think the journalists are needed to do that kind of thing, and it ended up really hamstringing the city government process because people were not understanding the information that they were finding. So that wasn't a question.
Hi, I just wondering, when you mentioned no one else was covering that particular area, is because just the lack of staff, or maybe because it's a minority area and mainstream media sometimes don't pay attention to communities with large population of undocumented because they don't have the right to vote or because political.
You want me to, as the white guy?
Mic's still on.
Yeah, no.
I think you're right. I think there are reasons to think that is true because of that.
I didn't quite hear the question. If
The question was essentially, was perhaps one of the reasons really not staff, the lack of staff, but a lack of interest in covering a poor, small minority community, which is, all of us who work at the LA Times know, has not always been the LA Times' strongest point. We cover West Hollywood pretty well, but do you cover Compton, and do you cover Bell, do you cover those areas well? And the question was, what do you attribute that lack of coverage to, more to a lack of staff or to the demographics of the area?
I'd say a little of both, really. I mean, you look at, I don't know, I don't even want to guess how many number of Latinos we have in our newsroom. We had what, maybe, I don't know. I don't even want to say how many because I don't even know. But, you know, I think there is a sense of that concept, that sort of view of areas. Let's take South LA, for instance, you know, once was seen as this is where crime always happens, this is where murder always happens, and that sort of coverage is just like, you know, look the other way, I guess, because it's just something we've already reported on before. In this town, the Southeast, like I mentioned before, in this area, 6 out of 12 cities under investigation for corruption. You know, we've wrote stories and stories, but did we ever go in there? No, so I guess, yeah, there's a little sense of that, but I also do still think that it's staff related also. You can't, I mean, I was interested in that town. I really took serious in that region because I had watched the coverage before, and I wanted to, you know, make sure that we were back in covering that area again, but it was just overwhelming, so it's a little of both, I would say.
You know, one of the things, I do think there was a sense that this area, it's, and I think you may have heard this too, and you also, these are not LA Times readers, okay? I do think there is that sense. I've argued this, and I think Bell proved this. People don't care where their stories come from. They want good stories, and where they want interesting stories. And interesting means a lot of different things. They don't care whether they're from Afghanistan, or Bell, or Dubuque. They want interesting stories that engage them and that are interesting to them for some reason.
The irony of that is also that there were citizens, there were people in Bell who were coming up to us and saying, you know, I started my subscription just to follow this whole Bell thing, and also because you guys are investigating this area, and so the whole idea of readership, you know, went out the window to me on that aspect.
So congratulations on this coverage, and it really makes me proud to be a journalist. I don't think you guys should have to answer really for the decisions that the LA Times makes about where to put reporters and what your staffing level should be. It's out of your control. But to broaden this out a little bit, as journalists, I'm interested in your opinion. You don't think that citizen journalists could do this type of work, and yet you have sort of one reporter covering 12 cities. What do you think needs to be done? I mean, does the Times need to, like, open up tip boxes in these towns so it's easier for citizens to tell you, hey, my property tax bill is really high, if they don't know what your extension is or who to call? Or how do you funnel that information into the experts when it's really a problem of supply and demand?
The guy who does the website?
The website guy, yeah, he does it.
There is, you know, there was this gentleman who I have yet to know who he is. He calls himself the editor, and he has a website. God, I
Watch
can't remember.
Our
Watch Our
City?
Cities, and basically his job was he was getting tired of corruption in that area that he eventually started this website and started reporting all the dirt on people. The problem with that website, and you know, is that he was getting information from third party, you know, he said, she said, kind of sort of deal. And so what do you do with that? You know, as a reporter, you get that information, you're like, I can't go based on what someone said, you know, from a third party. It just doesn't work that way. So he was sort of highlighting some of the issues that were going on in this area. And I mean, from at least I'm speaking for myself, I would look at his website and see, okay, that seems like something, he's on to something. I don't think he realizes that. And so I'd go back and I'd, you know, make my phone calls and start following up, and sure enough, you start digging stuff. So to a sense, it works. But, you know, like earlier mentioned, you know, the resources aren't there. You don't have that connection with expert that you can call, that they can take you seriously and will sit down and, you know, feel that they can sit there for an hour and talk with you about a certain topic. I think bonds was, like Paloma said, you know, I myself I'm not an expert on anything, period. And so, you know, bond stuff was just like, what? Talk to me about planet Mars and, you know, how it works and all this, and I'd be like confused. That's what bonds was like to me. And so until I gradually sat with the expert and I started talking to him about, bonds, about property taxes, how the tax rates work and how it affects each city and why it, you just get that information, and so you put that into your reporting and you package it, and like, as mentioned, you organize it better and it's more accurate, and I don't think.
Well, that's not quite answering the question. The question is, you still got 12 cities, you still have half the number of reporters you did in 2000. There's this renewed interest in Bell. How are you going to cover these 12 cities when you still have very limited resources? Citizens don't have the amount of time, and you're talking really about time and effort to just sit down with a document. Maybe they could figure it out, but they got day jobs too. So how, as we as journalists, and this is not a question particularly for you, but how do you as journalists fill that gap?
I think you do it like you normally do it, right? I mean, there's always been people who call you up and say, hey, I found this has been going on in this city. I requested documents. I have them here. Would you like to look at them? It starts that way also. Blogs are also now, I guess, another thing where you, get tipped off that way.
But I think that the truth is that this is the trend, right? It's going to be fewer and fewer journalists who get paid, a living salary to be able to do this type of thing. So how do you address that? And I think that that's why it's important that, we as journalists don't dismiss these people who are trying to do this on their own. And maybe it's a matter of training and, because I honestly think a lot of these things are, once you learn them, they're pretty easy, right? It's a matter of just interviewing experts, talking to the right people, asking the right questions, and confirming things. And if you can train people to do that, then maybe a lot of those citizen journalists can actually do a little bit more effective job of what they've been trying to do.
Right, and but there's also that sense, at the LA Times, what we did with this whole Bell thing is we created a online page on how to request for public requests, how to make a public request. That's one way of doing it, of educating people that way. I think we learned from our big interview that we did is we were asking, I heard people were making public requests, why weren't you meeting those requests? And they'd say, well, they didn't know what they were asking for. They'd say, I want to know this, and it wasn't really a request, it was more of a comment. Would you think of any examples?
I don't remember exact, but that was exactly, they didn't phrase it right, that kind of thing. Well, actually, the law says that the city officials are supposed to help them, but that wasn't going on in Bell. But I mean, I would encourage citizen journalists, the guys like Tom Paine, those guys were pamphleteers. I would encourage people to look and do that kind of thing. Do I think they can do it as well as we can? No, I don't. I would still tell them to do it. You will have people who come up with great stuff. That will happen, but.
If you encounter a public agency whose budget is inscrutable, is that a red flag of some kind? And also, how do you work around that, an inscrutable budget, and a budget that can't be penetrated?
I would say that is a red flag. Budget should be, it should be written in a way that the average citizen actually can do it. I mean, I would get a copy, take it to experts, ask them to explain it, and then I'd write a story about how inscrutable, how it's impossible to figure it out. And I think.
That's a law you can't get around?
If you can't get, you go to experts, ask them to see if they can explain it to you.
But there are no other avenues.
Not that unless the guy who's the city manager, the head of the organization will explain it to you, but those should be somewhat, you should be able to figure them
out. There's a number of young journalists in the room, or people who want to become journalists. Let me ask you the question that I often get asked: is what advice, speaking on this, would you give them? Would you say, aim for a mainstream media organization? Would you tell them, head for the blogging world? Would you tell them, start up your own blog and start writing about city in the Central Valley? What would you tell a young journalist who comes up to you and says, what should I be aiming for?
Young journalists, you guys want to answer?
I'm still trying to figure out what I should be aiming for.
Run for your lives.
I don't know. I think my advice, if you're interested in investigative journalism, would be to start doing it and start, looking for stories and start asking questions. Even if you're working for, even if it's for a college newspaper or for your own blog or for someone else's blog or website. I'd just say, start doing it and start asking those questions.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to do it, do it. Who knows what's going to play out eventually? We don't know what's going to happen when the economy recovers, if it recovers in the next decade. We don't know what technology is going to bring. It's such a different world. When I started, computers were just starting to come in. I actually can remember in grad school writing stories on typewriters. You know what a typewriter is? Who knows what's going to happen, And you guys, I'm sure, are prepared to do all those things, to write for blogs and newspapers and, magazines and do all those things. And in some ways, it's a brave, new, wonderful, interesting world that these different things are happening. I worry that we are the last generation of journalists that will get paid decently. That's something I worry about.
Hold on.
Exactly what's happened in Rizzo and the other council members and all those people that allegedly or actually did many illegal things. Felony anomaly, or is this kind of corruption in
The Rizzo and six now former, Rizzo, Angela Spaccia, who was the assistant city manager, and six now former city council members are all facing charges. No trial date has been set yet. Probably, I think, sometime in the spring, there will be a trial. You want to answer the other one? Or?
Just to add to that, pensions have also been reduced. That was a big thing in our story. The pensions of Bob Rizzo, Angela Spaccia, and the other council members. I believe Rizzo was supposed to receive, upon retirement, $650,000 in retirement payments, and that's been chopped down to $50,000 basically in payments now a year. So pensions was a big thing that they were able to address, and that's been another thing added to the whole arrest and charge. I can't think of anything.
Is Bell an anomaly? We're asked that question often, and I think, yeah, there's corruption in different places. It is hard to believe that the corruption can be as deep as it was in Bell. I mean, it's like everywhere we looked. You would hear the most outlandish rumors, and they'd be true. I'll give you an example. Early on, and this was at that meeting, the powwow we had, we had heard that this guy, Victor Bayo, had resigned from city council and was still getting paid his city council salary. Right? There's no way that can be true. So I asked him the question. It turns out Victor Bayo had resigned. They had given him a job as the only paid person on the city food bank, which meant he worked 4 hours a month and was getting paid nearly $100,000 a year. So it's hard to believe, the kind of corruption we found in Bell is happening. That's my belief elsewhere.
So I come from New Jersey, and I suspect that there's a lot of corruption there. And my question is, somewhere between the citizen journalists and the Los Angeles Times are a lot of smaller news organizations staffed by professionals who might be doing this kind of reporting, but aren't, often because they're staffed with young reporters who don't know how to do these kinds of stories. Can we create some sort of a template off of this kind of investigation that might be shared to make it easier for those mid-tier publications to delve into these smaller communities? And could that help the plight of investigative journalism?
I think we actually have seen some of that. I mean, I think the first story that we did was a simple story. You go look at the contracts. You know, other stories we did, the one about the meetings they didn't, the city council members were getting paid for these meetings of these boards they didn't go to. I mean, it's that simple stuff. I mean, I think our reporting got more sophisticated as it went on. I mean, and I think Paloma's stories are an example of that. But I mean, these are relatively, I mean, all reporters should, you know, covering a city. Ask how, get the contract. It's simple stuff. I mean, I think it's sort of basic reporting. Look at their expenses. It's all public record. I think that kind of stuff is simple, relatively easy. That.
But can you write some sort of a how we did it template that could be shared? Or did anybody think about doing
Is that on our website? How to get public records?
I was an intern for 6 months with Chicago, and my job as the intern, thank you. My job as the intern was to read everything about Bell and follow that model. And we did 25 different mayors in cities around Chicago. We didn't find nearly the same corruption, but we did find numerous examples where one town's mayor made 1 penny a year, where the next town over made $175,000 a year. So there was those discrepancies, and we did follow Bell as a model. So I think there are other stations that are doing the same thing.
So it's the next step, a follow-up to your investigation, you know, put something out like that. And
Right. Okay.
We started the week after you did it, the story, and it went for the duration of my internship.
Who are you working for?
The Fox affiliate in Chicago.
It's a good, good idea.
We've got time for one more question. Oh, and the near.
You have mentioned that as a professional journalist, you are different from citizen journalist. And my question is, what do you think is the most useful thing as to what you have learned in journalism school in reporting on stories like this?
Be my guest.
The most useful thing in journalism school, and remember where you are.
I went to journalism school, and Jeff went to journalism school, and Ruben's journalism school was at the Times. You know, the most useful thing for me from journalism school was doing internships and actually getting to go out and do stories. So I think that's why I feel strongly that, you know, once you start to do it, you learn how to do it. That's I mean, there's no better way to learn journalism.
I went to Columbia for graduate school, and it was I never had a journalism class at that point, never had worked on a school paper. And I just thought that, I mean, much of what we did was what Paloma just said. You know, you wrote stories, and they would just tell you how bad they were. You know, what did I learn that was most important to me? Maybe to be skeptical. You know, the old joke is, you know, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. You know, I mean, it's a healthy sense of skepticism.
I think what I've learned is really has been mostly from working with other reporters and seeing how they do their stuff. You know, I've seen Jeff in action, so I've taken some of what, you know, he's done and kind of used it in my own situations. I think there's anything that I took away from when I was going to journalism school at Cal State Fullerton, it was someone told me to be the first one there and be the last one out, meaning, you know, show up early because you never know what's going to happen before something is about to start, and be the last one out because people see you there and they see you being that last reporter there, meaning that that's the reporter that actually cares. That's the reporter that I take more serious because he's there all the way through. And I'd actually got compliments on that from going to council meetings, even though they were dull and boring. But I was there to follow up on stuff that people were telling me. And
No, I'm laughing because Ruben would be covering these Bell City Council meetings, and I would get up in the morning, and there would be an email sent to me at 2 a.m., and it would say, "I hate you."
there was a reason for that. He was sleeping, and I was like at 3 in the morning. And I'm hearing people still yelling at the council members, and they're just like, "Why am I not in bed?" But I mean, in general, people see you, and people have compliments like, I like you because you stay here. You care. And so I think one thing about journalism is that there has to be a balance of compassion, a balance of sort of the need to be accurate, and the sense of, if you think there's a story, follow your instinct. And you always, something that I learned from Jeff is there is no stupid question. Because, the question of how much do you make, that would have been a dumb question to ask, but here we are. So take that as a lesson that, it doesn't matter what you just ask the question. You never know what kind of answer you're going to get.
All right, on that excellent piece of advice, I'd like to thank all our guests and everyone who attended, and for our panelists.